And now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for the day. Colonel Tom Sheperd is currently the Director of African Studies and Regional Studies Coordinator in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. Colonel Sheperd's educational background includes a BA degree in Economics and International Studies from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He has 2 master's degrees, one in political science with a certificate in African Studies from the University of Florida, Gainesville, and he has a master's of strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College. Colonel Sheperd is a sub-Saharan Africa foreign area officer who has worked in defense attaché and security assistance related positions in Cameroon, Eritrea, and Kenya. Colonel Sheperd has spoken with us before, so some of you may remember him. Today, Colonel Sheperd will speak to us on the topic of China in Africa. Please join me in welcoming Colonel Sheperd.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say that it is a very, very real pleasure to be standing here in front of you today and have the opportunity to dialogue with you a little bit about this idea of China in Africa. As you can tell from my introduction, I have to do a couple of disclaimers up front. Number one, I am not a sinologist. Okay, I'm somebody who actually studies Africa just a little bit, and for those of us who study Africa, anybody who tells you that they are an expert on the continent is trying to sell you something, okay? Because it is entirely too big, too diverse to become an expert on the entire continent. However, this concept of China in Africa is one of these things that has a lot of resonance for us here in the United States because our interests in Africa are increasing. Our focus on Africa is increasing. And therefore, it makes a lot of sense for us to take a look at how other actors in the international stage who deal with Africa can either work with us or things that they can do can work against us, and vice versa. The things that we do can complement what they're trying to accomplish, just as sometimes the things that we do can work against what some of their goals are. So hopefully we'll get a better understanding of that and talking about that later today together. The second disclaimer that I need to put out is the one I'm sure for those of you who have been to some of these lectures you've already heard quite a bit. I am here talking in a private capacity. I am not here representing the official position of the United States government, the Department of Defense, the Army, or the U.S. Army War College. So this gives us an opportunity to have a one-on-one dialogue on what I think and my analysis of this situation leads me to. So, with that, this is the agenda that I'm going to be following for approximately the next 60 minutes, or a little bit less depending on how nervous I get and I start talking incredibly quickly, because this is probably one of the biggest crowds that I've spoken to in Great Decisions. And yes, you do scare me. Okay, so anyway, what I'm going to be doing is, first of all, in order to be able to understand what we're talking about and deal with what we're talking about, first of all, we have to set the stage and get the context. And with that, you can't talk about how the United States and China are relating to each other in Africa without actually taking a little bit of a look at Africa itself and some of the factors that are in the African strategic environment. And if you looked at the Great Decisions program and you saw the nice, wonderful little blurb with the very deep voice of saying, can the United States compete with China? Okay, they're talking about the economic growth of Africa. Well, let's take a little bit of time and actually look at some of the trade figures that are out there that have been so wonderfully presented by a just recently released General Accounting Office study that looks at what? U.S. and Chinese trade in Africa, and where they're complementary and where they're competitive. But in the end, that all sets the context for what we're really here to discuss, because China is a rising power, and as a rising power, they have interests. Well, the United States is a global power also has interests as well. And this is really what we're going to try to get at, is this idea of what are U.S. interests, what are Chinese interests, and then we can see where the friction points are and also where the areas of potential cooperation are, where we can either work against each other or work with each other in order to achieve a mutually beneficial outcome. And that's one of the things that we've got to look at, is not necessarily is the relationship competitive, not necessarily is the relationship cooperative, but under what circumstances will it be either competitive or cooperative, and is it possible to be both simultaneously, depending on the interest? And this is what I get for not having turned mine off. Okay? Never, never, never take your cell phone with you into a presentation. All right. Now that the comedy relief is over. Okay. So, and then finally, I will actually conclude with a few thoughts as to the nature of the relationship, and then I'll open the floor to questions. And like I said at the beginning, this is a dialogue. This is not me standing here and lecturing. Well, actually, it will be for about the first 45 minutes or so. But it's actually a dialogue where we get a chance to discuss and explore these issues together, because this is a very complex topic, an incredibly complex topic. And the viewpoints that you bring to the table are just as important as the viewpoint that I bring. And hopefully together we can come to a mutual better understanding of what this environment is and what it means for us in the United States. Because in the end, we are Americans, at least a lot of us in this room are. I see a few of our international fellows from the War College here. Thank you for coming. But in the end, you know, as Americans sitting in this room, it is about us and our interests. And that, as a national security professional, that's one of the ways that I actually do look at this a lot, and is the way that I'm going to be approaching a lot of the analysis of what does this mean, what does this mean in relation to our interests. So, with that, let's get started, and it's going to be a little bit of a busy ride. First of all, Africa. You saw from reading the Great Decisions paperwork that was sent to you, for those of you who got it, or from watching the video, Africa is booming. Africa is open for business. Huge economic potential. Absolutely huge economic potential. Okay, according to the International Monetary Fund, 7 of the world's fastest growing economies from the year 2011 to 2015 are projected to be in Africa. That's awesome. When we look at the global downturn in trade, Africa, the global downturn in trade had the least effect on Africa. African economies, on average, are growing anywhere from about 4 to 7%, in some cases more. Okay? Also, when you look at it in terms of population, you're talking about approximately 1 billion people, projected to be 2 billion people by the year 2050. Hugely young, meaning in terms of industrialization and productivity, that's a lot of latent potential. Notice I use the term latent, though, and there's a reason for that, and we'll get to it in a minute. And you also look at this map, and you see all of the resources that are there. And oh, by the way, that map gets updated every day, because as technology advances, we are able to find more and more resource deposits of varying things throughout Africa. Also, as technology changes, the demand for resources changes. And there's a term that the French used to use, Afrique utile versus Afrique inutile. Useful Africa, not useful Africa. Well, guess what? Useful Africa is getting a whole heck of a lot bigger from an economic perspective because of technology, both in what we can find and also what we need as new minerals become available. Think of it in these terms. Coltan. 20 years ago, who heard of coltan? That cell phone that just went off not 2 minutes ago, has coltan from Africa in it. How many of us in this room have cell phones? Give it 10 to 15 years. What other kind of technology are we going to have that might need a different kind of mineral than coltan, but it's found in Africa? Something to think about. Also, Africa. Now we start to get into some of the challenges and also advantages as well. Africa, it's a big country, isn't it? Okay? I want you to look at that map for a second and let that sink in. Let that sink in for a moment, just the sheer size. The United States can fit in Africa 3 times, continental United States. 3 times. You notice the entirety of China fits in Africa. The entirety of Europe and India fit in Africa, all at the same time. Now, distances. That also creates a couple of issues as well, because given those distances, Africa, unfortunately, is one of the least developed continents infrastructure-wise. Road density, electricity, water and sanitation. Yes, it's making great strides with electronic media, cell phones. Everybody in Africa uses a cell phone. Hardly anybody uses a landline. However, internet is a problem. Think about it. You've got to run cables. You've got to do broadband in varying ways. The signal only stretches so far. Go back to those distances and think about some of those challenges. But cell phones are out there, and it's huge the way that they're using them. I can do my banking in Africa via cell phone. Kenya, M-Pesa. Banking in Africa from the interior, from Nairobi to somebody in the interior, I can transfer money via cell phone. Can we do that here? So they're using technology in some very interesting ways. But again, look at it in terms of this. Road density, electricity, water and sanitation, things that we take basically for granted. This room with its electrical power. When you go to certain African nations, we'd have generators outside because you can't count on the electrical power staying on. What do you think that does from a business perspective or from a development perspective? It creates some interesting problems and creates some interesting desires and needs from the African perspective. And that plays into some of the things that China does. And as I was talking about electrical power, here's an example, a satellite picture of the Earth at night. Where's Africa? It's pretty dark. That inset map shows road networks and existing power networks, and some projected ones. Do you notice there's a lot of the continent that is not covered? This creates issues that have to be dealt with. And these are things you have to keep in the back of your mind as we look at how the United States and how China interact on the continent and what the effect of that interaction is, because this environment definitely plays a key role. Now, with that, let's transition to trade. Yes, Chinese trade with Africa is booming. Business is good. It has increased significantly. It is fast growing. It's up from about $10 billion in 2000 to $164 billion in 2012. I don't even have the projection figures to see where it's expected to go. Okay? 18% of Africa's world trade in 2012 went to China. Okay? And it's 14.2% of Africa's total trade with the world. Okay? Up from 3.5% in 2000. Huge differential. Another way to look at it is like this. You can see a number of different countries where Chinese business practices and Chinese trade touch. Okay? If you look at the world from a competitive standpoint, that looks incredibly intimidating, doesn't it? But what does it mean? Well, in total terms of global trade, in total terms of China's global trade, Africa is second after the Western Hemisphere. It's a close second if you just look at how Heritage Foundation defines the Western Hemisphere as everything except the United States. When you throw the United States in there, it isn't even a close second. The bulk of Chinese investment in the world comes into the Western Hemisphere. And then you've got a lot going into Australia. So China's in it for business, from a business perspective. So this gives you a little bit of an idea that things might be, from a statistical standpoint, things might not be as daunting as they seem. Okay, and we'll get into that. Let's take a look at overall U.S. and Chinese trade. Yes, China has overtaken us as Africa's main trading partner. But what does it mean? Let's dive into that a little bit more. This is Chinese exports and imports and U.S. imports and exports over time. What do you think constitutes the bulk of this trade? Anybody give me an idea? Natural resources, okay. Electronics, that's part of what some of the trade is. But it is natural resources. But what kind of natural resources? Are we talking oil? Are we talking minerals? Are we talking what? Rare earth? Oil. The bulk of U.S. and Chinese imports from Africa is oil. The vast bulk of U.S. imports from Africa is oil. Okay, let me read you a couple of figures from the General Accounting Office. Natural resources have constituted the bulk of U.S. and Chinese imports from sub-Saharan Africa. In 2011, petroleum products, primarily crude oil, accounted for 81% of the value of U.S. imports, while ores, metals, and minerals was only 9%. By comparison, petroleum and petroleum products, almost exclusively crude oil, accounted for 59% of the value of Chinese imports, while ores, metals, and minerals counted for 32%. Okay? So if you look at it from an import perspective, the Chinese actually have a slightly more balanced portfolio than we do, okay, when it comes to dealing with African countries. So because they're in it for a little bit more than just oil in some cases from the extractive standpoint, it might make a little bit of sense that they're actually in places where we're not. Something to think about. Now let's put this in even further perspective. I love these maps. This is where the United States and China import from. Do you see a lot of the same countries? One of the things that you need to keep in the back of your mind is when it comes to economic competition or the view of economic competition, the United States provides credits through the African Growth and Opportunity Act for 40 of the 49 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a subtle little difference with the Chinese. The Chinese only provide tariff-free imports to 30 countries because those are considered to be the least developed countries. And they also might be the ones that have something that they want and are also not capable of interfering with Chinese industries. Okay? Just something to keep in the back of your mind. So when you hear some of the talk out there about how the Chinese are undercutting us with their ability to bring in imports tax-free, actually we do a better job of that. And there's a reason why, and it's based on our focus on what we're trying to accomplish with national interests and what the Chinese focus on accomplishing with national interests is. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. And finally, exports. The United States and China are in competition. Well, from the look of that, we're exporting things to the same countries. Now, the interesting thing is, guess what? We sell different things than the Chinese do. Yes, when you look at the large categories of things, the Chinese sell finished machinery and services. The United States sells finished machinery and services. But there's a difference, okay? Ours, we're looking at the stuff at the higher end of the supply chain and the higher technology type issues. So when we're selling motor vehicles, the Chinese are selling ships. The Chinese are selling telecommunications equipment. When the Chinese are selling design and construction services, the United States is selling financial services. The United States is selling business services. The United States is selling professional services. That's what we're exporting to Africa. So yeah, we're competing. We're there in the markets within those same countries. We're actually doing different things and filling different niches in the supply chain. And that actually has a little bit of a difference when it comes to, again, national interests and who's doing what to whom and why. So with that, let's transition over to a quick discussion of national interests. Now, I can't help it. As a teacher, as a professor at the U.S. Army War College, occasionally we have to lecture and occasionally we have to define terms. So, because I'm taking a look at this from an interest-based perspective, I think it's probably a good idea to define for you exactly what I mean when I'm talking about interests. Because it's one of those words that different people define different ways. So by doing this, I'm going to put us all on the same sheet of music and you'll be able to understand why I come to the conclusions that I do in my analysis. Okay? Interests are desired end states necessary to the existence and prosperity of a nation or group. They may be expressed as physical or non-physical conditions representing continuity or change, things to be protected, promoted, or created. National interests are an expression of an actor's values in the external world. Knowing these interests is critical to understanding how actors develop policy, because interests form the basis of the ends or the objectives that policy should be focused on achieving. After all, since these are my interests, you would like to think that our policies are aimed at achieving those interests. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but, this is one of the things that we have to deal with. Everything an actor does in relation to the international system should be directly traceable back to interests. Okay? Now, core interests. That's one of those things that actually gets a lot of attention. When you start talking core interests, people in the international relations community tend to perk up a little bit. And there's a reason. Because they can be distilled down to a few basic concepts centering around security, economic well-being, promotion of values, and, depending on your point of view, a stable and secure world order. Interests, and therefore the policies put in place to secure these interests, can focus on both physical conditions and material conditions. And finally, interests affect us because it directly relates to the type and the amount of power that's going to be employed in order to achieve that interest in relation to perceived threats, challenges, and opportunities. When do you use military force? When do you implement economic sanctions? When do you create a coalition? All of those questions get answered or should get answered in relation to what is the interest at stake. Now, with that, these are core U.S. national interests, as written in the 2010 National Security Strategy. I want you to take a moment to read those. Believe it or not, this document is released by President Obama. Believe it or not, I can trace the same similar threads to national interests all the way back to the initial national security strategies that were put out by act of Congress by President Reagan. Core national interests tend to remain fairly stable. And what you can see with these interests is they do follow the outline that I just gave you earlier in those basic concepts: security, economic growth, promotion of values, stable and secure world order. With that, that takes us to U.S.-Africa policy. Africa policy should be aimed at achieving these in relation to the African strategic environment. Well, this is our 2012 Africa strategy as put out by the President. And what are we focusing on? Democracy, economic growth, the advancement of peace and security, and the promotion of opportunity and development. Why? You might ask. Well, it comes down to, again, core U.S. national interests. Those strategic objectives laid out in that 2012 Africa strategy directly affect the achievement of these core national interests. And how? And why do we have them in the order that we do? Well, it's because we're focused on stability, okay? In order to be able to trade, we are a trading nation at heart. What is America? America is business. We are a trading nation at heart. In order to trade, you have to have stability. But stability is not achieved by having a dictator stand there and clamp down on every form of dissent and control every movement of every minute of every day, everybody's life. Stability is brought in by this issue of good governance, representative governance, where people have access to the system, they have a stake in the system, and the system is accountable to the people. We have found that despite all of its warts, that, yeah, actually Churchill is right. Democracy is the worst form of government in the world, except when compared to every other alternative. Okay? And that's why we focus on democracy first, meaning good governance. What does good governance do? Good governance gets people to buy into the system, therefore have a stake into the system, and it also teaches compromise and how to deal with problems from something other than a I win, you lose perspective. If you don't get the good governance, you get some of the problems that you have in some of Africa's weak states, where it's, I have all of the power, and what is mine, and yours is negotiable. That does not bode well for stability. Now, if you get the stability, you have the kernel and you have the foundation for rule of law. Rule of law provides you a basis for economic growth. And why do I say that? Rule of law is critical because why are you going to invest in something where on a whim I can decide that today you can drill for oil at X, and then once you find oil, oh, no, that's now mine. I can nationalize it or do with it as I will, instead of you've sunk in the investment costs, you've developed it, and now I take it. Wait a minute. That's a high-risk, no-return business proposition. You're not going to get a lot of at least U.S. companies because, again, we don't control our companies on where they go. You're not going to get a lot of U.S. companies invest in an environment like that. And yes, in some places in Africa, you do find that environment. So rule of law, where you have the system functions under rules and regulations, and everybody knows what the rules of the game are. Okay? And then finally, promotion of peace and security. Special favorite of mine being in the security assistance business from time to time. And why is that? Well, let's think of it in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If, because of instability and violence, I'm concentrating on staying alive for the day, then I really don't pay a lot of attention to business or the opportunity to trade, to do other things. And you see this in certain places, say, for example, in the Kivus, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or you saw it in places like Somalia. And the instability that can then come out of those areas and affect countries that actually have fairly thriving political systems and economies, like Kenya. Sheberd, moving into parts of Kenya, disrupting Kenya's economy and disrupting Kenya's political processes and creating a threat. So instability flows outward, and then it drags down everybody else around you. So that's why we focus on those things. But one of the keys is the issue of democracy and good governance. Because as I pointed out, democracy and good governance is good for business. And America is a trading nation. So now, with that, we'll transition over to the PRC. Now, some people think that China is a relative newcomer to Africa. Not the case. Back in the 1400s, under the Ming Dynasty, you had a Chinese tribute fleet and trading fleet sailed all the way down to Malindi in the early 1400s. Ambassador Admiral Zheng. China pulled back a little bit, then you have the revolution, and China steps in to Africa to support its revolutionary brethren to help with the decolonization process. Hence you have the you can see the Chinese peasant soldier in the background supporting the African liberation fighter. But then you also have other issues as well. China as the good friend, providing aid and comfort. The picture of the doctor or the nurse working in Africa. I've actually seen that happen. I've been in places in the interior of Africa where you walk into a market, and all of a sudden a Chinese doctor pops up out of nowhere. It's like somebody put a little grain of rice on the ground, sprinkled water on it, and next thing you know, the guy comes out of nowhere. Where did he come from? He was there because of some of the aid programs that the Chinese put into place in their early days of engagement with Africa. And then finally, you have some of the more recent permutations or interpretations of China and Africa. I love the Economist cover there with the chopsticks reaching over and pulling the resources out of Africa. So which is it? What is China? What is China and Africa? Well, again, in order to get at that, we've got to look at core interests. These are the PRC's core interests as laid out in their 2011 white paper on peaceful development. It actually came out a little earlier because they started bouncing these core interests around in the Chinese press in the early 2000s. And then finally, in the 2009, you got the official pronouncement of these core interests in a U.S.-China PRC dialogue where one of their key members of the foreign ministry lays these out. And if you look at them, you can actually see, again, some of these same themes that I laid out in the Chinese core interests. Now, where's the difference? Well, what the difference is that how do you define sovereignty? How do you define preserving the territorial integrity? How do you define the preservation of the Chinese state? Here's one of the key interests. China is a one-party state. And the interpretation of those interests is decided by the Communist Party of China. Everything is filtered through the lens of continued dominance and control of the Communist Party of China, the CPC. Everything. Because China is internally focused. You have an issue of, again, remember I talked about that issue of access and accountability and why we push democracy? Because we have determined that even though it's ugly, even though it's contentious, it's a way for people to have compromise. China is a one-party state. So some people say that it is a party with a state, not a state with a party. And that creates a very interesting difference as how they approach the world at times. So what does that mean in relation for their issue for moving on to Africa? Well, here's their white paper. These are their goals from their white paper. But again, this is their Africa policy put out in 2006. As you can see, it kind of predates the official pronouncement of their core national interests. But if you look at it, those core interests flow all through those. And they're all centered around two things. One, access to resources. Two, acquisition of prestige. Why? Go back to my previous slide where I said everything is filtered through the lens of the maintenance of control and the continued legitimacy of the Communist Party of China. When you look at it that way, access to resources and their approach to economic growth and development might run counter to the way the United States sees things. And it is an area of friction that we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, one of the other things that the Chinese are very fond of saying is, quote, non-interference. Don't think for a moment that the Chinese don't interfere. But they interfere on things that matter to them. And again, if you go back to Rule 1 being the continued legitimacy and maintenance of control by the Chinese Communist Party, then you can see where they might interfere. Hence, you've got right there, it is specifically stated in their policy, you want benefits from China, you will support the one China policy. If you're friends with Taiwan, you're no friends with us. Okay? The other thing is, other things that also tend to come to the forefront have to do with how China defines human rights. Yes, China does define human rights as a core national interest from time to time. But again, how is it defined? It is defined through, again, and I'll repeat this over and over again like a broken record, through the continued legitimacy and domination of the Chinese Communist Party, their ability to control. Hence, to control how change takes place within China and the territories it controls, like Tibet. So this is how you get some things where, for example, the Dalai Lama a couple of years ago was going to visit South Africa, and after a few minor little subtle hints and other things, the South African government removed its permissions from the Dalai Lama to visit. You think there wasn't interference going on there? Okay? So again, actors have interests. Actors do what is best in order to achieve those interests. So, how does this play out in terms of us? U.S., China, and Africa, cooperation or competition? Well, in order to get to it, what we've got to do is we've got to take a look at What does the PRC really want from Africa? Let me give you an idea. Or at least this is some of the things that I've heard from a number of knowledgeable people and some things that I've come to on my own conclusion. Global power and global interests. China wants natural resources. They want to pursue business opportunities. They want strategic partnerships, i.e. diplomatic initiatives. And they also want something else that they don't talk about in the open press a lot, called the democratization of international affairs. And what does that mean? Okay? What that means is when we focus on global governance, we focus on the governance part, to quote a person that I respect a lot. And the Chinese tend to focus on the global part, meaning that what they're looking for is they're looking for legitimizing or showing ways that other forms of governance other than democracy can function and are good for people. Going back to, Rule 1, the continued control of China by the Chinese Communist Party. Okay? That's very interesting, and that creates a very interesting dynamic in the relationship where we sometimes clash. And I'll explain why I think that in just a few moments. But when you look at these, with the exception of democratization of international affairs, on the surface, guess what? Those are the same things we want. It's how we define what that end state is in relation to these objectives is where you run into the differences. Okay? So with that, Chinese goals and logic behind this is they're kind of stuck between long-term objectives, and believe me, I think the U.S. strategy actually is focused on the long term. And they're also focused on immediate returns and immediate payoffs. It's that classic problem of how do I deal with the here and now and the future? Well, they're dealing with that same problem. Now, there's a very interesting dynamic, though, in China that plays out and shapes how they approach that. And that's the internal dynamics within China itself. Our relationship with the Chinese in Africa is shaped, in my opinion, entirely by this. The internal policy debates within the Chinese Communist Party, how that gets reflected in the different positions of the government of the people of the Republic of China, and also the activities of some of the independent actors. Because here's the other thing to remember. China, when we talk China, we have this tendency to think this huge monolithic actor. It's not. It's multiple different actors who are doing, again, all actors have interests, and they do what they think is best in order to achieve them. So you have the different states. As part of the going out policy, they basically, over time, all of the different states have been turned loose to do certain things. The independent cities, i.e. like Beijing, or other special mandate areas like Macau and Hong Kong, they've been turned loose to go out and do different things. And oh, by the way, you have the Chinese Communist Party going out and doing different things, in addition to the government of the PRC. That's a lot of moving pieces. So again, you can't think of things in terms of a monolithic actor. Just like we have a number of different interagency tiffs here from time to time, I would imagine that this probably makes makes our system look actually relatively simple and tame. And why is that? Because these viewpoints all have an impact on how China reacts to the world, because they're all focused inwardly. It runs the gamut of very fierce nativists who are anywhere from a combination of we need to disengage from the world, don't trust the Americans, don't do anything, strong sense of nationalism gets fanned, to globalists who thinks that China needs to be a responsible actor on the global stage and engage in things such as global governance. Well, all of these different positions are fighting among themselves, and they're positioning themselves in different ways. And you also see them reflected in different business practices as well, and different actions of the government. Because one of the other neat things about this, and this is all identified by a gentleman by the name of David Shambaugh, who just put out a new book on China Goes Global. I highly recommend it, is that you can't identify this with one set department within the Chinese government. It's not like the joke here in the United States, all of the leaf eaters are in the State Department and all of the ones from Mars are in DOD. No, you find them scattered all throughout all of the different departments and all of the different states. So how they approach things is different. But with that, what we've got to understand still is always focus on that, is this internal debate. Chinese internal debate shapes how they react with the world. Because again, it's inwardly focused, and again, it goes back to Rule 1, the continued control and legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, how does that play out? And this is where we see different things, where we now get the idea of where we're going to get competition or cooperation. Mali. How many here are familiar with the situation in northern Mali and the intervention of the French? Good thing, bad thing? Well, Chinese are having the same debate, but it's going to be very interesting for you to take a look at these quotes from some of the aspects from one of the leading Africanists in China, He Wenping, and also one of the military think tanks, the Chinese Naval Research Institute. I want you to read those. Although France became involved in Mali under the banner of anti-terrorism, the nature of Mali is akin to a civil war, creates opportunities for Western and other outside forces to intervene in the internal affairs of African countries. We should be on our guard against the West's recolonization of Africa. There will always be many ethnic and religious conflicts in Africa. This provides external forces ample opportunity to interfere. And in my personal favorite, the call to deploy troops is an attempt to manipulate us. The West will not allow us to get involved in its traditional sphere of influence. And oh, by the way, the call to give money is also an attempt to take advantage of us. Why do you see some of these things? It's because Mali, in a lot of ways, fits into that category of global governance. And remember what I mentioned before when it comes to global governance? We look at governance from the global governance from the government side of things, i.e. how to do business, what are the rules of the game, and they look at it from the global standpoint. That's why they stay out of it. But the issue is this: they view global governance and things like Mali as an attempt to bleed them of resources, that we are attempting to constrain China by getting it to commit to places in the globe that are going to suck it dry and get it to take its eye off the ball of what really matters, which in some cases you see here is Western recolonization of Africa. They're out to stop us. That's a very interesting debate. One would think that the PRC, who has some of its own problems with extremism in certain places, Salafist extremism, and is doing business in places where there is Salafist extremism. And oh, by the way, the PRC was the largest trading partner with Mali before Mali collapsed with the coup. You would think that as a global trading nation that China would be interested in security and stability when these kinds of threats arise. But if you go back to that lens of that internal debate within China, it makes perfect sense as to why some of these quotes, when some of these positions are coming up. And this is the debate. It's not a question of cooperating with the West. It's a question of what is the West trying to go? What's in it? What's hidden? There's a hidden agenda here. So how do we deal with that? That creates an interesting problem, because when you look at Africa in those terms, using the 2012 Fund for Peace Weak and Failing States Index, the question for us, because of our interests and our values, is how much of a partner is China going to be in helping us deal with some of these problems that establishes stability and good governance. Once the good governance comes in, you then get that give and take, and that cooperative way of dealing with problems where you get, again, Winston Churchill, "'Tis better to jaw than to war." Creates an interesting conundrum for us. Very interesting conundrum. Now, the one thing I will throw back at the Chinese is, and again, this is where you see some of these accusations of free riding. China, under these circumstances, is very comfortable with doing business with whoever is in power. And there's a reason for that. Again, it's a one-party state. It's not used to dealing with dissent. It's not used to dealing with differing ways of doing business or contested ways of doing business in an open forum, i.e. like democracy. So it's used to dealing on state-to-state bilateral basis, and that's where you see a lot of their programs and a lot of their engagement. Hence their attitude of, it doesn't matter who's in power, he's got to do business. And we're here and we do business with anybody. And you see that play out in certain places where, for example, there were coups d'etats in Africa, and you also saw that play out in the attitude and how they do business within Darfur. Now, also, keep in mind, multiple disparate actors, all of them operating independently in many cases towards go out. All actors have interests and do what they think is best. So in some cases, it's given that confusion, it's easier for the Chinese and the PRC to actually take that position because then they don't have to deconflict a lot of things and internally. Okay? Now, the other thing that does is that leads us to the second friction point, which is corruption and governance. Again, good governance from a U.S. perspective, from our values, good governance is good for business. From a Chinese perspective, good governance is defined by their ability to control what is going on internally, particularly in areas that it is concerned about, Mongolia, Tibet, places like that, to control the internal dynamics within Chinese society. And you see this play out. Corruption Perceptions Index, 2012 data from Transparency International. Transparency International, great think tank. They make it their job to go out there and look at the effect of corruption on business in a lot of ways. And you see two things here that are going to link us to my next point. Access to financing and corruption is the two major problems of doing business in Africa. From the corruption standpoint, okay, yes, there's a lot of it out there. And it's not confined to China alone. European companies, American companies get hammered with it all the time. I can give you two examples of British Aerospace, BAE, and also Siemens got busted for slush funds and paying people off in different places in Africa. Here's the difference. Siemens and BAE got nailed by their home nations, and they got fines anywhere from $500 million to $800 million. Just until recently, it was okay to do bribes. It's part of doing business in China. Yes, China is learning. China is doing a better job of at least putting in some legal codes to deal with this. But it's all relatively recent. It wasn't until 2011 that they passed laws making it illegal for Chinese nationals to bribe foreign officials, notice I said officials, for economic gain. Now, how that gets enforced is going to be something a little different. My question that I will have to do is I'm going to stay in abeyance on this one and making a complete judgment call. But I'm going to say it's too early to tell because the question becomes, is again, given those internal dynamics and that internal focus, are these new anti-corruption efforts things that are going to be honored more in the enforcement or honored more in the breach? And that's going to take some time. But why is this important to us? Remember, I go back to that issue of good governance. And corruption undermines good governance. Remember what I said about people having an idea that they have access to the system and the system is accountable to them. Well, being accountable to them, meaning the system has to work and actually work the way it's intended to. Accountability is not me going up to somebody at a clerk, giving them $20 and then getting them, because I gave them $20, to move me to the head of the queue and stamp my papers. Okay? That also undermines rule of law. And remember what I said about rule of law being that basis for business and investment. If I know what the rules of the game are, then it's more likely I'm going to invest. Okay? And where this also comes into, and because of China's proclivities to play a little loose in the corruption standpoint, you've actually had some negative impacts on U.S. businesses, particularly in places like Angola, where our anti-corruption laws forbid our businesses from participating in these activities. But inside Angola, it's mandated that you have to have a certain percentage of Angolan companies as part of your portfolio in order to do business. Well, guess what? The Angolans do this in some cases. Our businesses don't want to get associated with that because they don't know who's doing what to whom, and then they get held legally responsible here in the United States for some of these activities. Creates a little bit of a drag on U.S. investment. Which takes me to my next point, where we've actually got this probably right here is probably the one area we probably have the most potential for synergies with the People's Republic of China. And it's in the issue of investment. And again, go back to that economic potential of Africa, go back to that youth bulge, go back to that productive youth population that's out there. Africa needs jobs. Africa needs jobs. One of the things I want to make very clear up front, though, is when it comes to investment, you see a lot of Chinese investment there, okay? One of the things that you have to do is, again, you have to dive in underneath the details a little bit and understand that investment and economic growth doesn't necessarily mean sustainable economic development. It creates a virtual cycle where states are able to then economically sustain themselves, okay? The bulk of the investment is still going into the extractive industries sector, meaning finite resources. Once the resources are gone, if you don't have the good governance to then create some of these services and create some of this virtual cycle that's required, then what ends up happening when the money's gone? It's the type of investment that matters, not just the fact that it's being invested. Hence, a lot of your economic growth in Africa, in many cases, can be found in places where it's extractive resources in nature. So when you look at Chinese trade, you actually find an imbalance in the continent where extractive resource countries are running a surplus with China, and a lot of other countries that are major trading partners are running huge, huge, huge trade deficits, which have had some very negative effects on African countries, i.e. particularly within the textile industry. Now, that said, I want you to take a look at some of the figures because here, the United States, we invest more in Africa than the Chinese do. But a lot of our investment also goes into the area where we define as development, places like PEPFAR, healthcare, education, the more softer side of being able to help set up good economic growth. The Chinese invest a lot in infrastructure. Infrastructure plus education done properly might be some of those things that help set the basis for economic growth. One of the other things that the Chinese are doing here right now as well is they're creating some special economic zones where they're moving production into Africa. That, I think, is very interesting and has to be watched because if they're moving the means of production into Africa, they're changing certain African countries' positions in the supply chain, and they're no longer at the lowest end of the supply chain. They actually become manufacturers. Now, here's where the nuance comes in. Infrastructure. I like the infrastructure piece because if I'm moving the factories over into some of these special economic zones, hopefully that creates the dynamic for the inter-African trade that the United States thinks is required for African states to actually become economically self-sufficient. It creates that virtuous cycle where the states are trading among themselves. Think of the market. And it also opens opportunities for us to do what we do best. We sell services. Wonderful opportunity. The issue becomes, though, is, again, type of infrastructure. Is the infrastructure that's being built, is it the kind of infrastructure that is actually connecting African countries with each other, or, and particularly with the interior, as you can see, is just practically empty as all get out, or is it infrastructure that is designed, again, to move goods from Africa, production centers, to the coast for export elsewhere? If it's moving stuff from the coast to export elsewhere, it's not doing anything for Africa writ large. It may do something good for that country, but it doesn't do anything good for Africa writ large. And when you look at some of the challenges in Africa, what that does then is that creates economic refugees who migrate to some of these countries in search of a job, where you now have the issue of governance access and accountability and other things, if they're not capable of accepting that influx and that movement of population, you now have the seeds for instability laid all over again. South Africa, huge, huge, huge unemployment problem. South Africa, in relation to some other countries, also has huge, huge, huge opportunity. So you get a lot of people from other African countries moving into South Africa looking for a job. So you can start to see where the tensions can begin to pop up with second and third order effects. What we as the United States are looking for is we want intra-regional African trade, because then that spreads development, creates a virtuous cycle, and states are able to support themselves. So, in conclusion, having looked at some of the potential friction points and areas of cooperation, what does it all mean? Because again, when you looked at the Great Decisions literature, and you also heard the Great Decisions video, it was this question: can the United States compete? The question is not can we compete. The question is when should we compete? How should we compete? In certain cases, economic competition is good if it's looking in and it's complementing each other and providing that virtuous cycle. In other cases, competition is not so good. When can we cooperate? When do we find that mutually beneficial environment? And it's all going to be driven by these things. Number one, primacy of interests. It's all about interests. All actors have interests. All actors will do what is best in order to achieve those interests. Okay? The United States, particularly when it comes to Africa, has to be prepared to deal with a wide variety of actors in that continent who are going to be working for their own ends. In some cases, those ends are going to be complementary to what we want to accomplish, and in some cases, they're not. We have to be able to be prepared to deal with that, just as China has to be able to be prepared to deal with that as well. China's increasing footprint on the continent is going to present both challenges and opportunities for us, as we will present challenges and opportunities for the Chinese, depending on how they define their interests and how they define what a successful end state is for those interests. Second, the nature of the relationship then is going to be entirely dependent on our ability to link up those interests. Is there congruence? If there's congruence, the potential for cooperation exists. But I go back to that last point on great game or not. You got a couple of different things there at play. Okay? Number one, remember, I go back to that lens through all of the Chinese interests are filtered through. That continued legitimacy and success of the Chinese Communist Party. That explains a lot somewhere when you look at certain areas where there is potential for cooperation, as one would think. Healthcare, anti-malarial medication. The issue in Mali, for example, you would think would be an area for potential cooperation on helping African states secure themselves. But as you saw from the quotes, maybe not. And what you have to do is you're going to have to look at that prism as to how is China looking at this? Are they looking at it from the perception of security? Are they looking at it from the perception of cooperation? Or are they looking at it from the perception that cooperation might actually undermine the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore their ability to maintain control of the state? So you've got to go a little bit deeper. And finally, the other thing to think about with this, in great game or not, is this is up to the Africans as well. How the Africans manage this relationship is going to be very, very critical. There is some talk on the continent about, oh yeah, happy days are here again, that the Africans need to manipulate and manage the competition between the Chinese and the United States. What I can definitely say is that from a U.S. perspective, everything I've seen and everything I believe is we're not looking for a competition. We're really not. It takes two to play that game. We would prefer not to. It costs too much. But from some African perspectives, this ability to get the great game going again harkens back to the halcyon days for certain forms of doing business of the Cold War, where leaders were able to successfully play us off against the Soviets and therefore put off making the hard decisions that have to be made in order to develop good governance and inclusive societies. Because in the end, when I threw that weak states slide up there, that's not really a U.S. problem. It's a U.S. problem in some ways, but in a lot of ways it's an African problem. And it's because of leadership and governance. And those are internal processes. So if they make this choice to manipulate things in a way, to play the China card, as has been done, to avoid making the hard choices about setting in inclusive societies, building societies based on rule of law and good governance, which then create those bases for that virtuous cycle for development, then we're going to be seeing a lot of these same problems all over again. And it's up to the Africans on how they do that. We can't do that for them. What we can do, though, based on our interests, is make our own strategic choices on how we are going to engage with that, both with the Africans and also engage with the Chinese. So whether it's cooperation or whether it's competition, the choice isn't entirely up to us. There are a lot of other actors out there who have choices. And based on their choices, they may put us in a position where we have to choose to compete in certain issue areas. I would prefer, as a security professional, I would prefer not to. Okay? So, with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't bored you so much.